welcome to IAA's final webinar of the year from the IAA Public Policy Council. Today's webinar is on country of origin claims. We have done a series of webinars during the course of the year this year, looking at the way in which regulation has evolved and whether regulation is evolving in a logical way that both protects consumers and at the same time creates an environment that allows brands to thrive. The objective of these webinars is really to think about the ways in which these rules are being created, how they're working, are they effective, and trying to increase the information and collaboration out there so we all understand sort of the ways in which these rules and the way that people are thinking about these rules are working around the world. So today we're going to talk about country of origin claims. I'm Jeff Greenbaum. I'm the head of the Public Policy Council at the IAA. I've sort of ended up here because I wear a couple of different hats. One is this Public Policy Council hat at the IAA. Another is that I am the chairman of the Global Advertising Lawyers Alliance. And everybody in the webinar with me today is a member of the Global Advertising Lawyers Alliance from around the world. You've got Delia from Switzerland, Caroline from France, Kelly from Canada, Maria from Russia, and Adrian from Mexico. So we've got this incredible representation of lawyers around the world who we're all gonna think through together the way in which we think about country of origin claims. I'm also an advertising lawyer at Frankfurt Kernan in New York, as we are all advertising lawyers, because that's what we do. And so what we're going to do is we're going to jump right in and talk about this topic. People are watching this on all different platforms around the world. Each of them has various ways in which you can comment, ask questions. If you do, somehow through the magic of the internet, if you ask a question on Facebook or on LinkedIn, somehow it will make its way to us and it will appear on screen, and we'll incorporate that into the conversation. If you want to see the slides, if you've missed something, the presentation will be back on YouTube after this is all over at the YouTube link, and you can certainly go back and review that again. Okay, so let's jump in. What we're going to do is we're going to start with the United States and talk a little bit about the environment in which we're thinking about made in USA claims in the United States, and then start to look at the way in which countries around the world are thinking about similar type claims. And then we're going to sort of get back all together again and talk a little bit about that. So in the US, since the 70s, the way we've really thought about US origin claims is based on an enforcement policy statement that the Federal Trade Commission issued. An enforcement policy statement is not a law or a regulation. It's not independently enforceable. It's simply the FTC's view about what would be an unfair or deceptive act or practice under the FTC Act. In other words, the FTC Act in the United States is very general. It prohibits unfair, deceptive acts or practices, but doesn't give very prescriptive statements about the kinds of things that would be deceptive or unfair. So as a result of that, in order to help advertisers and to sort of promote fair practices, the FTC issues all kinds of guidance to tell people what they believe would be a problematic practice. So one of the pieces of guidance that the FTC gave long ago, like I said, in 1997, is the Made in USA Enforcement Policy Statement. And it basically set forth the FTC's view about what would be a deceptive Made in USA claim. And the FTC has taken this standard very, very seriously. Made in USA enforcement in the United States has been a big enforcement priority at the FTC. In many ways, the FTC brings as many Made in USA cases as it does any other type of case, both enforcement actions, informal enforcement through closing letters. It's been one of those areas that the FTC really has put a lot of resources into and continues to put a lot of resources into. There are some other standards in the US that apply to US origin claims, but because the sort of main focus of compliance really is on sort of FTC enforcement and the FTC standards, that's what I'm going to focus on here. So what the FTC's enforcement policy statement says is that if you're going to make an unqualified claim that a product is made in the United States, you have to substantiate that the product was all or virtually all made in the United States. What does that mean? Well, what it means is that all significant parts and processing that go into the product have to be of US origin. It only allows for a negligible amount of foreign content. A sweater where there's maybe a button or a tag that is not of US origin probably doesn't disqualify a product from being made in the United States. But the final assembly or processing of the product does have to happen in the United States. One of the difficulties of applying this rule is it's just all or virtually all. There's no percentage standard. There's no bright line test that helps you determine whether something is or is not made here. Instead, what the FTC wants you to do, in addition to asking the question, did the final processing take place here? And is there only a negligible amount of foreign content? Is they want you to look at two really important topics. The first is what are the costs that are not attributable to US parts of processing? So what they're asking you to do essentially is to look at all of the costs associated with all of the inputs in the product and ask, are there any significant costs that come from non-US sources? That's number one. And second is, how far removed are any non-US components? So for example, if the iron in a hammer came from outside the US, even if the iron is only a negligible cost in the cost of the hammer, I mean, the hammer's basically made of iron. You can't say that it's not made, that's made here. On the other hand, if you're talking about a computer that is expensive to make, that has a lot of different components, but that there's some petroleum that was from outside the US that was used to make some of the plastic and some of the keyboard, it may be that that petroleum is so far removed from the end result and of such small cost in comparison to the overall cost of the computer that it wouldn't disqualify you from making a Made in USA claim. Some other important things to keep in mind about enforcement here. Number one, claims can be express or they can be implied. The presence of an American flag on packaging or in advertising can communicate a Made in USA claim. Similarly, recently the FTC issued some letters closing some investigations where they actually mentioned the use of American pride. And I think that that's interesting. In other words, a company that's expressing its pride of having manufacturing operations in the US may in fact communicate a claim that the products themselves were all or virtually all made here. The FTC has also repeatedly told advertisers that similar words like produced, built, other types of words that communicate similar types of messages are governed by the same standard. There's one word that the FTC has officially approved as meaning something else, which is assembled in the US. The FTC believes that assembled does communicate something different. It means that it was last substantially transformed here, but that as long as it was in fact put together here, and as long as that was not simply a very simple process, but it was a meaningful manufacturing process, that it's okay to promote something as being assembled here, even if the parts came from outside the US. The FTC has also said it's perfectly fine to make other types of limited claims, such as that a product is designed here. However, the FTC has cautioned that if you're going to make a claim like a product is designed here, it's important to be sure that it doesn't communicate an implied claim that the product was also made here. Finally, it's perfectly fine to communicate a qualified Made in USA claim, such as that a product was made here from imported parts. The big news at the FTC on the Made in USA front is that the FTC issued a Made USA labeling rule that was adopted in the middle of this year. It only applies to certain types of advertising, in particular labeling, as well as some internet advertising websites. The rules are the same, the standards are the same. The significance is that if you violate it, the violations are $43,000 per violation, which is crazy high when you think of millions of consumers that can be exposed to your advertising. So to give you some examples of some of the types of enforcement, we see lots of enforcement from the FTC. Here's in a case that the FTC brought against Nectar Sleep. Basically, this was the second time the FTC had looked at Nectar Sleep. That's why they asked for $750,000 in damages. Nectar Sleep was making claims that its mattresses were made here. In fact, when they were just simply, they weren't. The FTC has also brought a case against this glue maker for, again, falsely claiming that its products are made here. Record-breaking settlement, $1.2 million, the largest ever in the area. So as I said, some of the challenges we're thinking about that I want to revisit as once we hear from my friends from around the world are, what do you do when there's no bright line test? You have to communicate something's made here, but you're not sure where to draw the line. Second, it's often very difficult for manufacturers and retailers to really track down all of the different components of the products and realistically understand, where all the components came from. Another issue is that the world is not so simple, right? Products are sourced from around the world, but people do have substantial manufacturing operations here. How do you communicate effectively and safely that a product is made here, is manufactured here, or that you've got manufacturing operations here, or you're proud of your employees that are here, without confusing people about where the components are from? And then finally, these statements of American pride, the statements of being pleased about where your headquarters are, things like that. How do you do those things without creating uncertainty about messages that you're communicating? So with that, I'm going to now switch over to Kelly so we can hear about how Canada thinks about similar issues.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Jeff. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining today. I'm Kelly Harris, and I am also an advertising lawyer. I'm from Toronto in Canada. So before we dive in, on screen, you'll just see a quick roadmap of what I'll be covering about origin claims in Canada today. So we'll start off with some trademark stuff. We'll move to enforcement guidance from our federal regulators, and then we'll talk about other types of origin claims. All right, so the first topic is, of course, trademarks. Like in many other countries, there are significant trademark protections of national emblems in Canada. The coat of arms of Canada, our national flag, these are protected by the Trademarks Act in Canada against unauthorized commercial use. One could seek express permission, but in general, those are emblems of the state. The 11-point maple leaf, which is the maple leaf in the middle of our flag, can be used in a commercial design or trademark. There are some caveats to that. It needs to be, in good taste. You need to be able to disclaim the right to the exclusive use of it, of course, and can't prevent other people from using it. And if you go to the next slide, you'll just see that our domestic trademark protections are also amplified internationally through the Paris Convention, as Canada has, of course, notified the World Intellectual Property Organization of its protection of the coat of arms, national flag, and the 11-point maple leaf. So uses of those as indication of origin, a little bit more tricky, and most folks prefer to talk about made in Canada or product of Canada. So if you look at the next slide there, Jeff, we don't have, kind of similar to the US, we don't have a specific legal provision setting out how to make a country of origin claim in Canada. There's no specific law. What we do have is a general provision that prohibits making false or misleading representations in advertising. And this provision is under the Competition Act, which is our federal competition law, and is enforced by the independent law enforcement agency, the Competition Bureau. And similar to the US, the Competition Bureau issues regulatory guidance that sets out its interpretation of this general law, including for particular claims, as is the case for country of origin claims. So that brings us to this guidance here that you see on screen. So in contrast to the US, we do have some fairly specific percentages that are associated with supporting these kinds of claims from the perspective of the Competition Bureau. And the first kind of divergence here is there are, of course, different kinds of claims. And we can sort those into made in Canada, which is the lower threshold, and product of Canada, which is the higher threshold. So we'll start with the made in Canada type claims. So this is where you have many components coming into a product. And in the Bureau's view, this kind of a claim would not be misleading under our competition law, where the three factors on screen are met there. So first of all, the last substantial transformation has to occur in Canada. At least 51% of the total direct costs of producing or manufacturing the good must have been incurred in Canada. And critically, this claim must be accompanied by an appropriate qualifying statement, which will change depending on what the support is for the claim. So, made in Canada with imported parts. would be an example of the with imported parts would be the qualifying statement, or it could be with domestic and imported parts. And this is important because that qualifying statement was at issue in one of the enforcement actions the Bureau took with respect to country of origin claims. So a few years ago, a parka company called Moose Knuckles was making a made in Canada claim, but they didn't have the qualifying statement. And so they entered into a consent agreement with the Bureau to donate $750,000 over 5 years to charities in Canada to resolve that investigation. So that is very important to include that qualifying statement. So the other type of claim, if you've really got quite a lot of origin in Canada, is the product of Canada claim. And so to meet the threshold from the Bureau's perspective to make that kind of claim, the last substantial transformation has to have occurred in Canada. But all or virtually all of the total direct costs will have to have incurred in Canada. So that's like 98%. No qualifying statement is required. You can just say product of Canada. And so, I think some questions, of course, will come up here, which is, what does substantially transformed mean? So the Bureau's view is that goods would be substantially transformed when they undergo a fundamental change. So, in the form, the appearance, the nature, such that, the goods afterwards are new. So you can't just kind of add your finishing and, meet that qualification. It needs to be quite substantial. And in terms of determining what the, what the costs are that you can include in this calculation, this is really where things get quite tricky. It is hard, first of all, to determine what's in what bucket and which costs can go in and should be part of the calculation. But the Bureau has, some very high level guidance, which, really you need to only take into account expenditures on the materials that are incurred in the production or manufacture, and expenditures on labor, that can be reasonably allocated to the production or manufacturing of the goods. Generally including overhead, it's not included in the calculation. But, if there is overhead expenditure that could be directly related to the goods, so their production and manufacture, it can be reasonably allocated. You could include some general overhead. But this is where the analysis really falls, is what's in that calculation and how can you support that. So if you just go to the next slide, we do have some similar requirements specific to food. So the Canadian Food Inspection Agency has its enforcement guidelines when making these kinds of claims, which are very similar. Made in Canada, the last substantial transformation, you need the qualifying statement. And, to make a product of Canada, again, virtually all of the major significant ingredients need to be Canadian in origin. There are some things in food that are just not available in Canada. So, spices or coffee or things that really are produced by other countries, if they're negligible, then that's okay. And you can also exclude packaging material and, agricultural feed and that sort of thing from the calculation. And the CFIA, if you're in a regulated industry, they have some commodity-specific guidance for fish products or meat products or dairy. And on that point too, there's some provincial level requirements to keep in mind too. So, Quebec, I think Manitoba as well, there's some provincial level guidance for food in particular. And just on the last slide here, some other things to keep in mind. And related issues, think about visual claims. So even if you don't make a made in Canada or product of Canada claim, once you start putting a maple leaf into the mix, you could get yourself into an implied claim of product of Canada. So if you want to do that, you need to make sure that you're providing additional context to clarify the use of the maple leaf. Just like Jeff said, what is the connection to Canada? Because absent more context, you might get yourself into some trouble. There are some things that are excluded. It's okay to use food grade names. Canada Fancy is a grade of food. So, you don't need to worry about that. Or the Canada Organic logo. You can see I've got that there on the screen. There's also mandatory country of origin labeling statements, CUSMA, as well, the new NAFTA, I should say, the more neutral way of saying that. We say, Canada first, but, origin statements required for CUSMA or packaged products, dealer declarations. I've included some of the forms that you would be required to put on prepackaged products to indicate an imported product. You don't need to worry about that because it's a legislative requirement. And in general, it could be okay to have claims other than made, product or made in Canada, if they're not false or misleading. So packaged in Canada, designed in Canada, processed in Canada, prepared in Canada. But you should really be considering a qualifying statement for those kinds of claims.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Kelly. Hi, everyone. So I'm Caroline Bouvier from France. I will first provide some clarification about the claims we are talking about, and then I will briefly present the legal framework and the sanctions when country of origin or local origin claims are not true. And I will also share with you the results of investigation carried out recently by the French Consumers Protection Agency. So next slide, please. Regarding the claims, I just wanted to highlight that country of origin claims or local origin claims are different from CE marking, because CE marking is mandatory for all products covered by one or more European directive or regulation that expressly provide for it. It allows free movement of the goods throughout the EU. And but it's not a certification, and it does not ascertain the product's geographical origin, whereas made in France or made in EU. So the next slide, please, Jeff. More precisely, the applicable rule depends on the type of products concerned. If we are talking about manufactured products, as a general principle, there is no European regulation nor French rule which would impose that the product bears a label mentioning the country of origin of the products imported or manufactured throughout the EU. But some manufactured products have to bear the origin of the products, in particular cosmetic products. And for other products such as agricultural products, food products, or seafood, the designation of country of origin is compulsory. And same for protected designation of origin or protected designation under EU rules. If you are awarded this designation, you must bear this mention on the products. And in France, there are some voluntary initiatives that I will detail thanks to the other slide. It's a certification called France Origine Guarantee. So it's, for instance, there are a couple of associations, but this one is a famous one. It's called Pro France, which has been recently created in 2010, whose purpose is to promote companies that manufacture in France. And you have to meet some conditions to be awarded this certification. And most precisely, the place where the product takes its essential characteristics must be located in France. And from 50 to 100% of the cost price must be generated in France. So as of today, approximately 100 companies have been awarded this certification. And the way it is used, the way it is affixed on the packaging, or the way it is used in commercial communication is strictly monitored by the French Consumers Protection Agency. And we will see later in the presentation that some companies have been sanctioned because they falsely refer to this certification. So we will see that later. So going now to the legal framework, thanks to the other slide. So the Union Customs Code sets forth the non-preferential rules of origin used to determine the country of origin of goods manufactured or imported in the EU. And there are basically two concepts to determine the origin of the goods, namely the wholly obtained products and the products having undergone a last substantial transformation. So basically the same concept as been in the US or in Canada. So if 2 or more countries are involved in the production of goods, the concept of last substantial transformation determines the origin of the goods. But the system is a bit more complex because the rules vary depending on whether or not the product is listed in a specific annex of the code. So if the product is listed in the annex, there are very specific rules on percentage to be complied with. And when the goods is not listed in this annex, we go back to the last substantial processing rule. So I just wanted to briefly present the EU framework of these rules. And under French law, so it's basically sanctioned. So next slide, please, Jeff. Voilà. French, the made in France claim are, as other claims, must comply with French consumer code, basically, and it's the same as in the US and in Canada. The claim must be true, and you must be able to substantiate the claim. And there has been a recent change in consumer code, thanks to a law on climate dated July 2021. Now, consumer codes clarifies that any inaccurate reference made to reference to made in France or origin France in violation of the EU customs code is an unfair commercial practice. So now if we have a quick look at sanctions, basically legal entities and even legal representative of the company, but just let's focus on legal entities may be sanctioned by a criminal fine of up to 1 million euro. And the judge may decide that the amount of the fine be equivalent to 10% of the average annual turnover of the company, calculated on the basis on the last 3 annual fiscal years, known at the time of the Diligence Acts. So it's quite a huge amount, or even in recent changes brought by the climate law. It amended a bit the consumer code on this on the sanction side. So even 80% of the expenses incurred to commit the litigious commercial practice when it relates to an environmental claim, such as made in France. And you have additional sanctions like the publication of the decision. And if a consumer or a competitor wants to sue the company before civil courts, they may be awarded monetary damages based on tort law if they prove that they have suffered a prejudice. So if we have a quick look at investigation and enforcement, the French Consumer Protection Agency, so DGCCRF in France, monitors origin marking of the products. And when violations are found, there are different scenarios depending on the seriousness of the facts. So sometimes you have cease and desist letter with a administrative fine if you fail to comply within the deadline imposed by the DGCCRF. And sometimes the DGCCRF, if the public prosecutor agrees, offer to the company to enter into a settlement agreement under which the DGCCRF agrees not to share the file with the prosecutor, so no criminal lawsuit launch, provided that the company agrees to discontinue the litigious practice and to pay an administrative fine. And the existence of the settlement agreement, as well as the amount of the fine, is published on the website of the DGCCRF, which is a name and shame sanction as well. So it must be taken seriously by companies. And for very serious offenses, an official report may be drawn and shared with the public prosecutor, who will decide to launch criminal lawsuits against the company. And recently, the DGCCRF conducted some investigation to control the way country of origin claims and local origin claims were made. So this report has been published in July 2021. So it recorded approximately 50% of violation. Certain action or certain monitoring led to the sending of warning letters, and for most serious cases, formal notification made to the public prosecutor, one of which concerns the false mention made in France on the packaging of face masks, which had been manufactured in Poland and in Italy. And there are some examples of other violations in the reports, which I presented briefly on the other slides. So, for instance, the claim French company with a French flag, or the claim France origin guarantee, so the certification which had been affixed on 30 products, 13 products, whereas only one had been awarded the France origin guarantee certification from the private association I was referring to previously. So basically, to conclude, when the made in France, and next slide, please. When the made in France claim must not be used because the criteria are not met, you may use, as in the US or in Canada, more limited claims, but you must be careful because the claim must be substantiated and consumers must not be misled. And for instance, if you reproduce a huge French flag with any of these mentions, so these limited claims on the packaging, but if you have a very small label or information regarding the real country of origin, it could be deemed an unfair commercial practice. If the brand name is registered as a French trademark, you can affix on the product French trademark, but you must be very careful not to mislead the consumer about the real origin of the product. So if it has been manufactured abroad, it is really recommended to be very clear on the packaging about the real origin of the product, in addition, along with the mentioned French trademark. And the wording made in France may not be registered as a French trademark, obviously. And we have the same rule as in Canada regarding French flag or any emblem of the French Republic, because we implemented the Paris Convention is in our regulation. But a drawing or a sign using the colors of the French flag may be registered as a French trademark, as long as the sign does not look like the French flag. So you must have a different shape or a different size, and it would be acceptable by the French trademark, accepted by the French Trademark Agency. So that's why briefly I wanted to share. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Oops, what's going on here? Here we go. Okay, all right. Thanks, Caroline. Okay, now we'll go to Adrian in Mexico.
Hi, nice to meet you all, and it's been very insightful to hear about the regulations of these kind of claims in other countries. Compared, for example, with the countries that have been described before me, I think that the regulations in Mexico are a bit less strict, and we do not have such a strong enforcement of these kind of claims. And the symbol that you are looking at screen is the officially recognized symbol that the government authorizes for certain producers or manufacturers of goods to actually claim that their product is made in Mexico. But it should be emphasized that the authorization is not over the words Hecho en Mexico in itself, but only over this complete symbol. There are actually no specific regulations that put some requirements on manufacturers. For example, there are some requirements of when you can use the symbol and which criteria you need to meet to be able to use the symbol. But these regulations are only limited to the symbol itself. If you are not using the symbol, but you are saying that your product is made in Mexico simply by using the words Hecho en Mexico, there is actually no specific rule of what kind of characteristics your product must have to use these words. So that's kind of a big difference, I think, because well, just from this initial conversation, I think that there is more flexibility regarding how and when you can use, or you can say that your product was made in Mexico. If we can move to the next slide, please. Well, this symbol has been protected in different status over the years. Could you move to the next one, please? Initially, it was registered as a trademark. This symbol was started to use in the decade of the 1970s, specifically in 1978, and it was part of a program of the government to try to increase the consumption of Mexican-produced goods. So the idea was to tap into national pride a bit and to create this program where manufacturers could apply with the Ministry of Economy to request the authorization to use this symbol and to try to improve the position of the Mexican products in the market. These regulations for the symbol did not change too much over almost 30 years, and it wasn't until 2004 that the regulations were updated and several changes were made. For example, at the beginning, these kind of authorizations would only be granted for associations or chambers of certain industries, but not to specific manufacturers. So in 2004, again, with the idea of trying to position Mexican products in a more favorable situation in the market, there were some additional possibilities to obtain the authorization to use the symbol. And one of the major changes was that now individuals, companies, or any other person that was not necessarily, a group of companies or a chamber of an industry could apply and could use this symbol Hecho en Mexico to distinguish products that were manufactured in Mexico. For a time, actually, the Mexican Ministry of Economy registered these trademarks before the trademark authority in Mexico, and to this day, these trademarks still exist. But there were some objections in the legal community because they consider that the trademark in itself was not the best idea to protect this kind of claims of origin. So eventually, the legal status was changed to a symbol. And the idea of a symbol is that it does not require a specific registration, but only an official recognition to obtain this status. So it allows the government a little bit more of a broader capability to enforce these kind of symbols, because by having a different status than registered trademark, it cuts the dependency from a trademark registrations, and it may be used, for example, in different products that are not specifically provided in the description of the trademarks that were previously registered with the Ministry of Economy. Also, I will mention it a little bit more in detail in a moment, but another point to be mentioned is that there are more different scenarios in which you could request an authorization to obtain the use of this Hecho en Mexico symbol that have been motivated in part by international treaties, such as the one that the new NAFTA that was saying. That I find a bit funny because I know that in the US they say US first, USMCA, and I didn't know that in Canada they say CUSMA Canada first, because in Mexico we also said Mexico first in TMEC. So that's just something I noticed right now. But could you please move to the next slide, please? So the symbol, as I said, has been changed over the years, but the idea is essentially the same. It's a specific symbol which shows an eagle. An eagle is the national emblem of Mexico. And one of the ideas of the regulations that surround this kind of symbol is that it must be used in exact this manner. There cannot be any modifications either in color or in the font that is used to write the letters, or even in the order or the place where the elements are in the symbol. But they must be used in this exact manner. So, for example, one of the reasons for which one could have their authorization revoked to continue to use the symbol is if one uses it with some modifications with different colors. Some people use it, for example, with the colors of the Mexican flag, and all of those uses are considered unauthorized and can lead either to fines or can lead to the cancellation of the authorization to use these symbols. But as I said, there is no prohibition and there is no limit for manufacturers to use only the words Hecho en Mexico. The problem is using this symbol completely. Also, for example, in Mexico, we have a very strong and strict laws regarding the use and authorizations for national emblems, which include obviously the flag and also the Mexican coat of arms. And those kind of symbols usually cannot be used in commerce in any way. They are usually used only in a specific official acts or official documentations or government agencies, but usually you cannot put a Mexican flag in your products because that may be considered not exactly a misleading claim, but a violation of the laws governing the national symbols in Mexico. So if you want to use any official symbols, this is the closest you can get, other than infringing the law. Could you move to the next one, please? The process of authorization is relatively simple. Actually, it's free to obtain this authorization. Usually, it was the ministry. Previously, it was the Ministry of Economy who did the authorization in itself. But since 2017, the procedure has changed, and now what they do is they grant authorizations to private entities, and these private entities are now the ones that are charged with examining these new applications of people who want to use the symbol, and also to make sure that these people comply with the requirements of the law. As I said, the first requirement that you must comply if you want to use the symbol freely is that the product must be manufactured in Mexico. But besides that, you need to meet one of these 4 scenarios. Like I said, they're a bit more flexible than in other countries, because here, for example, the products may be composed from materials from another country, or it may be actually products that are fabricated by companies that are not entirely Mexican capital, or that even have headquarters or in other countries. For example, the automotive industry in Mexico is one of the most important national industries. And so there are some models of cars that are exclusively produced in Mexico, and they are only produced for the Mexican market. So even if these brands are foreign in nature and their funding comes from foreign countries, some of the models that are exclusively produced in Mexico have been authorized to use the emblem of Hecho in Mexico, because they consider that they meet one of these criteria. For example, the production is done in a Mexican plant with Mexican workers, and so the idea that some of most of the production comes from Mexico is let's say the main element that is considered when deciding to grant this authorization. Could we move to the next slide, please? The authorization is free of cost. You only have to comply with the requirements, and you don't have to pay anything to these either government agencies or private entities that can certify and authorize the use of the emblem. But you do have to renew it every 2 years, and every 2 years you need to provide evidence showing that you still comply with these requirements, that the product is still either manufactured and composed from products that are originated in Mexico or that are produced in Mexico. And like I said, the authorization can be revoked if it's not used in accordance with official regulations. There are some other regulations about this symbol. For example, it may be used in packages or bags, but it has to be within a specific position in the bag. It has to be of at least a certain size. The size depends on the specific size of the product. But the main point is that this use must be complying with the regulations that the government has set for this symbol, so that there is uniformity in the way these manufacturers use the symbol of Hecho in Mexico. And I think the last thing that I would like to explain would be the consequences of not using it correctly. As I mentioned before, there are general advertising rules, for example, about making false representations about the product, and those still apply. If you falsely indicate that your product is made in Mexico, even if you're not using the symbol, you may be subject to some kind of sanction or fine, but it's not specifically because of you're not complying with some specific regulations regarding the Hecho in Mexico claim, but simply because maybe your product is not made in Mexico at all and you are falsely claiming that it is. So also, even though the symbol must be authorized to be used, there is no specific sanction for using it without authorization. The closest sanction that would be closed in the Mexican system would be a general prohibition in the industrial property law that forbids the use of official emblems in connection with products when used as trademarks. So this, in the end, is regarded as an official emblem, and so if it's used without authorization, you may obtain a penalty, but only as a violation to an industrial property law and not because of a violation of the laws governing this symbol in itself. And I think that's most of the things I wanted to share with you today.
Okay.
Great. Thanks, Adrian. So now we're going to switch to Maria in Russia.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for this possibility to speak about Russia. So I will speak briefly about this regulation of made in Russia, and we'll speak about enforcement practice and such thing as certificate of origin. Let's go to the made in. Next slide, please. Yeah, we have on the one hand we have regulation on consumer protection, which requires manufacturers to indicate the place of manufacturing. And as you see, the violation of this rule leads to not very high level of sanctions, but generally the rules on the address of manufacturing are being followed by different market players if we are talking about retail sales. On the other hand, we have competition laws which prohibit some unfair competition practices and misleading consumers. And in this respect, when you claim that something is made in Russia while it's originating from the other part of the world, can be treated as such violation of the competition law. And fines here are higher. Of course, I can say that all those fines can be multiplied based on the various criteria. So it's not like the final amount that you can be sanctioned for violation. Also, I need to say that national symbols, which were referred to by Adrian, Kelly, Caroline, are also protected in Russia as like national symbols and have their own protection. National flag can be used on for instance, packaging, but is not protected part of the trademark if you wish to register a trademark. So in this respect, you need to be careful when you use national symbols because there are some restrictions. And let's go to unfair competition cases. So I would like to illustrate two cases. One is regarding the tea, which was claimed to be originating from the Krasnodar region. Krasnodar region is the south of Russia with the subtropical climate, and there was a claim in the marketing campaign that this tea was like grown in such conditions, in such unique climate, while in reality the tea was imported from different South Asia countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, and so on. So it was qualified as an unfair competition behavior. And the company was not fined because they stopped the violation. They stopped production. But yes, this case was and is still very relevant to the claims on origin. And the other case relates to the claim with reference to Switzerland. It's made under the brand of Boucheron, which is well known in Russia, and they tried to claim that the chocolates were like Swiss made, although they in reality were made in Russia, although the raw materials were imported indeed. But again, chocolates are not usually made per se in Switzerland or in Belgium, for instance, with the Belgian chocolate. So it's very difficult to say that it's original Swiss chocolate. And company was forced to change the The labeling, as you see, the old one was with the Swiss cross, and there was some also references to Swiss original Swiss taste, while the new packaging has a cow, which is like a national symbol of Switzerland. But I will leave this to Delia when she will speak about Switzerland. So they tried to remain as much as possible connection with Swiss, but not so obvious. At least for now. They were fined for 250,000 rubles, which is something like 8,000 euro. Not very high level of fine, but still a precedent case for the Russian legal market. And I would like to also to speak about the certificates of origin. Certificates are not something which is required, but can be useful if you import the goods. And for instance, if the goods are originating from underdeveloped countries, then there could be some preferences in customs duties, or there could be rules for non-preferential use, non-preferential rules for customs duties. So sometimes certificates of origin can be a useful thing. If you wish to confirm that a product comes from Russia, then a Chamber of Commerce can issue a product, a certificate of origin from Russia. And this could be also useful for some reasons. There is also another reason why origin is important, particularly in the public procurement sector, where we have preferences for domestic manufacturers, and it's it depending on the sector of or industry, the level of modification and the level of assembling, the level of transformation of a product will give you the title, the right to claim that the product comes from Russia or not. It really varies among the industries. For instance, in the healthcare sector, it's very much more developed in terms of the level of modification that is required to claim that the product is made in Russia. And it can be vital for public procurement processes where there are domestic competitors. If you don't have domestic competitors, then you are more or less safe. But if you have them, or at least two of them, then potentially you will be withdrawn from the process at all. So it's important. And for export purposes, there is a project also maybe very similar to what Caroline said about the French experience. We have this project of promoting Made in Russia label, and there is an agency that issues some kind of certificate made in Russia for companies that meet certain conditions like credibility, reliability, and things like that. That's a brief overview on the Russian perspective. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Okay, and last but certainly not least, Delia, we're going to hear about Switzerland.
Thank you very much. Welcome from Zurich in Switzerland. So we'll start right away with the next slide, Jeff. I want to talk to you about the actual voluntary use of designations of geographic origin as marketing claims and as trademarks. So I'm not talking about mandatory kind of compliance designations. We, of course, have rules in federal law as well for specific product categories there. So on the next slide, maybe to give you a little background on the rules we have today. Before 2017, we had only vague rules in federal statutes. And we more or less had case-by-case specific rules out of case law, out of individual precedents. There was a general prohibition to use the Swiss cross as trademark for products at least. But since 2017, we have federal statutes defining very precisely the criteria for a geographic origin of products and services and for certain claims. So we have that in the Trademark Act, we have a Code of Arms Protection Act, we have various ordinances defining the rules in more detail. And it's also important to know that those rules apply to all designations of geographic origins used on the Swiss market. So it does not only apply to Swiss-made or any other Swiss designations. It would also apply if I would make a made in the US claim on a product that's offered in Switzerland, for instance. So that's something that's important to know. And based on this new regulation, providers can actually use the Swiss cross if they fulfill the criteria I will mention later, also as trademark. And that's a good rule for providers because the Swiss cross, yeah, was quite attractive before already to use for products, but now you have those rules allowing that actually for products of Swiss origin. So on the next slide, I try to make some examples of actual covered claims from a Swiss-made perspective. Classic claims, of course, Swiss-made, made in Switzerland, things like that, but also Swiss recipe, Swiss quality, things like that. I remember what Jeff said in the beginning. So this American Pride issue is coming up in Switzerland as well, with more kind of quality addressing terms and claims. But also if you use a Swiss cross or the Matterhorn, Wilhelm Tell figures and images like that, that would be considered a designation of Swiss origin. What is still not allowed for use by private parties, at least, is the Swiss coat of arms depicted below. There are some exceptions, but very limited. So what are the criteria for Swiss or other geographic origin of a product? As I said, we have really detailed criteria now in the law, depending on the product in question. So for natural product, it's usually a place of extraction, harvesting, in case of meat, milk, eggs, where those animals were actually kept. Then for foodstuffs and processed natural products, so-called, we have a weight criteria, very specific weight criteria. So 80% of the weight of the raw materials, as well as the activity that provides the essential characteristics, need to be in that specific country. So for instance, in Switzerland. And so now it's of course very important to know what raw materials would need to be considered, and so we also have very specific rules for what raw materials are available in Switzerland. So I think, as Kelly mentioned before, for Canada, that's of course something that's being considered in Switzerland as well. So the so-called self-supply rate is something that's decisive there. And then for other products, on the next slide, we have the so-called category of industrial products. It's basically everything else that's not a natural product or a processed natural product. We have a manufacturing cost criteria. So 60% of the relevant manufacturing costs need to have incurred in Switzerland, but there are two other criteria as well. So the activity that gives the product its essential characteristics needs to take place in Switzerland if it's a Swiss-made claim, and at least one essential manufacturing step as well. So the reason for the second and the third criteria is that part of the manufacturing costs, and that I think that's quite important for a lot of providers, is that research and development, for instance, can be part of those manufacturing costs. It can also be an activity that gives the product its essential characteristics, but it cannot be an essential manufacturing step as such. So you will need at least one actual manufacturing step that is of importance that also took place in Switzerland. So really the detail or the rule that made it quite attractive for providers to follow those rules is that the manufacturing costs are now defined precisely, and that they do not only include raw materials and actual labor, things like that, but also R&D, quality assurance to some point. They do not include simple packaging or just quality assurance that is not standardized or prescribed. But other than that, you could do a lot of with the design costs and research costs that prove rather important for providers based in Switzerland for at least some of the products in question. Again, of course, we also have natural products that cannot be produced in Switzerland, raw materials which are not available, and for those we have exceptions as well. There are additional rules, sometimes more strict rules, usually more strict rules for watches, for instance, because Swiss is an important claim, or Swiss made is an important claim for the watch industry. And we also have certain specific rules for cosmetics. On the next slide, we also have those criteria for services. So the place where the person, the entity providing the service has the registered office is considered the origin of a service. There is even a rule for subsidiaries, so foreign branches. So if a Swiss parent company has a foreign subsidiary, there is still a possibility of a Swiss-made claim if the criteria are met of the parent company being headquartered in Switzerland. That company or the subsidiary is actually administered from Switzerland, and the indication of source that is used is similar to that one provided by the parent company. So the parent company would be headquartered in Switzerland, would have no issues under Swiss law to designate its offers as of Swiss origin. And so in that case, a foreign branch could offer the same services under the same designation. On the next slide, I want to highlight that I think, as in other jurisdictions, we also have the possibility to not address the product or service, usually the product, in its entirety as being of a certain origin, but we could also say there's a Swiss design involved, there's Swiss research involved, but this is only allowed if kind of the activity took place in that respective country entirely, and if the Swiss or the other geographic origin is not displayed more prominently than the rest. If you use a claim Swiss-made or similar in advertising, so in an ad, let's say, not specifying what product is actually of Swiss origin, it is considered that all promoted product services, all shown or depicted product would need to comply with country of origin criteria. That's also something that proves quite important actually in practice. And then on the next slide, or on the first slide, I want to quickly talk about sanctions and enforcement. We do have criminal sanctions, fines of up to 500,000 Swiss francs. Well, that's of course a very high amount, and we haven't seen any such fines yet. But just to let you know that those criminal sanctions are actually foreseen in the statute. There's also, of course, possibility of civil actions, interim measures, injunctions, damages are possible there, and there are civil cases in that field. Given that these issues have gained a lot of importance in media, also with the increased enforcement actions, I will come to that later, there is quite some reputational risks if you do not follow the rules there. On the Swiss market, of course, it depends on the product, on the ads, etc. But there is some reputational risk involved as well. I want to quickly talk about what is actually being done enforcement-wise. So let's start in Switzerland. We have the possibility that customs are doing random samples, seizures for imported products. So then usually the importing entity or person will get a friendly cease and desist letter first from our Federal Trademark Office, because they are kind of dealing with enforcement in that regard. First, it will be focused on dialogue, but the Trademark Office actually has more powers. They could file a criminal complaint as well. In case of trademark applications bearing a Swiss cross, for instance, or another designation of origin, you will receive a refusal if the Trademark Office does not see the criteria met. There are certain specifics that you need to include in your application that you can actually file a trademark including such a designation of origin. We have, of course, competitors, consumer protection organizations, etc., that could issue cease and desist letters, file criminal complaints or civil actions. And then, of course, we also have self-regulatory instances. In Switzerland, it's the Swiss Commission on Fairness, and they issue recommendations, and quite some recommendations in recent months and years on that topic. So they can also publicly announce whether or not they deem an ad as complying with those rules or not. And then we have a kind of important and I think very interesting enforcement activity that's really brand new. It's a new association called Swissness Enforcement, so really focused on that Swiss designation of origin theme. It's a public-private partnership. So also authorities such as the Trademark Office I was mentioning and other partners are working together, trying to make or raise awareness, but also to foster enforcement of those rules. And that's something that's new for Switzerland. But enforcement doesn't really stop at the border. Interestingly, on the next slide, I summarized a few points on enforcement abroad. That's something that's new under the new law, and it's of course focused on Swiss indications. So technically, of course, our national laws, they stop being binding at the border. But as I said, our Trademark Office has a mandate to monitor foreign trademark applications, for instance. They send notices to advertisers and trademark owners abroad. They use usually the local embassy to do that. They inform local trade associations if they are of the opinion that a Swiss designation is used that does not fulfill the criteria for origin. And then some foreign trademark offices actually contact our office and require their approval for new trademark applications bearing a designation of Swiss origin. And it has been proven important for enforcement in China. And I think that's really something that is new and kind of interesting. And I haven't seen that in other spheres of the law, and I think that's something that it's important for our international viewers as well. So to move on, I included some graphics showing the different cases abroad. As you can see, we have quite a high number of cases abroad, but based on that Swiss law, as I mentioned. And on the next slide, I again highlighted some enforcement measure in a little more detail. So I talked about the seizure at customs. We have seen a lot of cases on that. Then I think what has proven most effective, surprisingly, to be honest, is really the intervention by our Trademark Office abroad. I included some details, some examples that actually happened where an intervention by our offices, by our Trademark Office, proved effective. So to sum up, maybe quickly, Swiss law regulates the voluntary marketing claims, but not just for Swiss designations, also for other designations. We have a statute allowing the use of Swiss cross and other Swiss claims for products and services, also as trademark. We have the practice of the Swiss authorities that became much more strict in recent years due to the statute, of course. We have a particular situation where enforcement does not really stop at the border. We have higher sanctions than we had before, and we have also the risk of civil claims, which may result in quite some costs as well, of course. So that was a quick run through Swiss law on designations of origin.
Great, thanks, and thanks to everyone for joining. Thanks to our speakers. It was such an interesting session and so interesting to hear the differences in the way we're thinking about very, very similar issues and how dramatically differently they're applied around the world. So anyway, thanks all for joining. Thanks to those of you who've been giving us some shout outs on YouTube and other platforms. And we'll look forward to seeing you in 2022 for some more IAA webinars. Everyone, thanks again for joining. Have a great holiday season. Take care. Thanks, everyone.